Visit Sailrite.com for all your project supplies, tools, and instructions.
Hi, I'm Eric Grant with Sailrite. In today's tutorial video, we're going to show you how to make a knee roll cushion with an extreme curve. And this knee roll cushion has a fabric backside. And you can see here there is a fabric pull installed in this, and this fabric pull has a zipper in it to insert the high foam and then insert the low foam through the zipper on the underside. So this is a very complex cushion process, but it does teach you a lot of techniques that we haven't really taught before. I've been promising this video for well over a year. We've finally done it. So let's get started and show you how to build a curved knee roll cushion with a fabric backside.
Most knee roll cushions do not have this extensive of a curve along the front, but we decided to show something that is very difficult to do, to show the entire process. If you can do this, you can do any knee roll cushion with a fabric backside. Let's get started. First, we're going to show you how to cut the high and low foam so they are perfectly matched up.
We're going to be using 3 layers of foam. This is Cushion Right Premium, and it's a firm foam. And this is Cushion Right Closed Cell. It'll be used as a barrier to keep water from coming up into the foam if it's sitting in a pool of water. We're going to glue these two together. Then we're going to be using a 1-inch on top, but we'll do that after we glue it. So we're going to use this Cushion Right foam and fabric adhesive from Sailrite, and we will coat the side that we're going to glue to the closed cell, and we'll also coat the closed cell in the same process. Make sure you coat both surfaces, otherwise they won't stick well. When you're able to touch the glue and it doesn't transfer to your fingers or your knuckle, you're ready for bonding. So we're going to take the closed cell and we're just going to glue it on top of this one. And you do have a little bit of working time, so if it's not perfectly in position, you can actually move it around a little bit. I have my closed cell on the bottom, I have my firm 3-inch on top of that, and then I have my 1-inch, which I'm going to be using for my high riser on top. Now I haven't glued this, you don't need to because it sticks together fairly well, but the foam on top of closed cell sometimes moves, that's why we glued that first. Then we're going to position, you can use a pattern. This is the old foam, this is the top side, so we need to make sure the top side is facing up, because this obviously is the top side, the closed cell's on the bottom. And we need to make sure everything fits perfectly. This is the high-rise foam, the low-rise foam. Once it's in the appropriate position, the top side is facing up, we're going to mark around it with a Sharpie marker right up against the old foam. If you don't have foam, you may be using a pattern. The process is exactly the same. We've marked around the perimeter. We're going to remove the high-rise foam, making sure that the low-rise foam doesn't move, because we need to mark where it is going to be cut as well. So we're just going to mark here between the foam. This is where the fabric pull will be positioned later on. And now we can remove this. Probably a good idea to mark top, especially on the high-rise foam. This is going to be removed here in a minute after we're done cutting. You can use McLube, which is a dry silicone, to coat the blade foam saw base and the bar, which makes it slide a little bit easier.
While we're cutting the foam, let's talk about different types of foam. Density has to do with longevity, or the quality of the foam. The higher the density, the more the foam will recover over a longer period of time. The IFD, indentation force deflection, has to do with how soft or firm the foam is. If you use your foam frequently, we recommend a high-density foam. If not, a standard foam will work fine.
So with that cut, we're going to cut on this line next.
Just remember, the softness of the foam does not determine the density. Actually, density is measured in the weight of the foam.
Now we can remove the 1-inch foam and we'll mark this top. And now we have a low-rise foam and a high-rise foam for the knee roll. So I put a mark on my hole cutter here. We're going to drill holes so that we still provide some breathability. And it is glued, so you just have to grab it and pull it out. But it actually works really nice here. So we put holes about every 4 inches apart to allow for great breathability. Pretty easy. I wouldn't wait more than a few hours after you glue it, because the glue will get more firm as you go. So we're going to do this, and we're also going to put them in the high rise as well, just in the middle of it, about every 4 inches. That's all there is to it. We are going to glue the 1 inch to the high rise foam, so we're going to coat this surface and also this surface really well. Now after the glue has become tacky, it's ready for gluing, and you can move it around again. And that's what I'm going to demonstrate here to get everything matched up perfectly. We're going to start at this end.
We'll be using the foam to create the bottom plate of fabric. That's next.
This is cushion underlining material. You can see through it, and it has little small pores. It comes in a few different colors. This is the white. We're going to take our low foam. This is the top side. This is the bottom. And we're going to position it on this. It needs the bottom plate, which is what this underlining's for, needs to be the exact same size as the foam. So we need to make sure it fits on this piece of fabric perfectly. So we're going to butt it up, making sure the top side is up, bottom side is down. And do we have enough material everywhere? It looks like we do. So I'm going to use my scry ball, and I'm going to mark around. I'm basically right at the edge of the foam, or a 1/16 inch out from it, and that's all we need to do for this. Once we mark around the perimeter, we're going to remove this foam and mark around this edge as well. We'll show you that after I mark all the way around. So I've marked around it. Don't move anything. Put your hand on the low foam and remove the high foam. Okay, and now, without moving this foam, trace it where the fabric pull is going to be. So right along this edge. Now remove the low foam and mark on the inside IN for inside. Now we're going to cut this out with scissors. We are not going to cut this where the fabric pull is, but just the outer perimeter. All right, so we need to put a zipper in the low foam portion. The high foam, which is this one, will have a zipper installed in the fabric pull around there. But we need to put a zipper in here. So I'm going to go almost all the way to where the high foam is, and stay away from this edge by at least 1 inch, and cut this to size. This is for the insertion of the foam. So we're going to cut it, and then I'm going to go ahead and put double-sided tape on it so that I can keep it nice and straight. This is a coil zipper, number 5 by Linzip. Teeth are on the top, no teeth are on the bottom. So I'm going to put double-sided tape on the side with the teeth, and I'm going to put it very close to the raw edge on both sides. I've peeled off the transfer paper, revealing the glue. The teeth would face down, and you want to make sure you put this on the inside. That's why the IN is up. And just put it along this bottom edge. I have it about probably 2 or 3 inches from this edge. It doesn't really matter where it goes. It just needs to stay out of anything that we're going to sew. So it goes down like that. I'm going to take some of the scrap cushion underlining material, and I'm going to fold it in half like this, and I'm going to baste it here. Before you put the final stop on, you got to put the slider on. So I'm going to separate the teeth, and the slider would go on so the puller is facing down. This is our slider. It is a single pull, non-locking slider. Goes like that. Just force it on the end, and then zip it down about like that far from the edge. We'll be moving it when we sew up to it. So we'll put this on now. Now we don't have to worry about the slider. I'm sewing in about a 5mm stitch length right next to the zipper, and I will do some reversing here. Okay, so before we get up to the slider, I'm going to sew a little bit closer to it. Make sure the tab's not in the way. and then bury your needle, which it is, and lift your foot and push the slider past so you can just continue to sew, and then lower your foot. So my needle's buried, I'm going to lift my foot, I'm going to pivot around, and I'm going to sew over the teeth. You want to make sure you sew through the teeth. I can feel them here. And then I want to reverse it a little bit here. We want to lock this down well. It's easy to sew through a small coil zipper like this. Bury the needle on the other side, turn your fabric around. Looks like I need to go one more stitch, so I'm going to lower it and do it by hand. There we go. Needle's coming up, pivot, lower, sew down this side. So about an inch from the end, I'm going to use a seam ripper and I'm going to penetrate the underlining, making sure that I'm not damaging the zipper. Once I get a penetration, I'm going to use the ball end and just slit it right down the middle. This is a kind of what I call a dirty zipper approach. You can see the zipper on the underside, but it also covers it, and we'll stop about an inch from the other end.
Now I'll be creating the top plate of fabric for the low foam.
This is Eversoft. This is the pebble version. We also have a smooth version. It is a 4-way stretch, so it stretches in all directions, which is really nice for a project like this. We're going to turn this one over. This is going to be the top plate of the low-rise foam. So this is the top side of our low foam. We're going to put a sew foam on this. So I'm going to cut a rectangle that's a little bit bigger than our piece, so we can just glue sew foam to it, and then we can trim it to size. So at least 1 or 2 inches outside the edge of this. We're going to glue the sew foam with Cushion Right foam and fabric adhesive. This is an inexpensive spray. It's actually a great spray because I never seem to, no matter how long I keep one can and spray with it, the nozzle never seems to clog up. Even with 3M things, the nozzle seems to clog up. So we sprayed the backside of our fabric. I'm going to move this out of the way without getting any glue on the front side. And then I'm going to put my sew foam. This is a 1/4 inch sew foam. Okay, so here's our sew foam. And the sew foam has a fabric backside, which is on this side, and that's so that our stitches don't pull through. We want to spray on the foam side. This piece is a little bit bigger than what we need, but we need to make sure that we spray both surfaces so that it bonds well. When the surface is tacky and the glue no longer transfers to your finger when you touch it, then you can bond the 2 pieces together. So we're going to put our Eversoft on this, and then we're going to work from the middle out, working out any bubbles that are in it so it's nice and flat. Turn this over so the vinyl is down, and place your foam on top of it, making sure that it's within the vinyl parameters. Right there, I can kind of see through it in a way, with the top facing the sew foam. Then we're going to trace around it with a Sharpie marker. It's the only thing that really marks the sew foam well. I'm sure there are other things. And the top plate of the low foam should be the exact same size as your foam. Unfortunately, this may cause some glue to get on your scissors. We're going to cut right on that line because the spray glue can get your scissors a little bit goopy, but you can clean it with McLube or even WD-40 in a rag. So you may be asking, why do we put a 1/4 inch sew foam on the low foam plate? Well, we want it to be nice and tight. If we don't do this, the low plate sometimes is not as tight in the over the top of the foam. This 1/4 inch sew foam almost in a way makes it fairly stiff so that it takes out any of the looseness of this low plate. So here's a look ahead at the low plate here when compared to the high plate, and you can see there is no looseness. It's usually seen here along the fabric pull. That's because we use that 1/4 inch sew foam in this. In lieu of that, you could install buttons or put some fabric pulls in specific spots, or you can use the sew foam and sew quilting or channeling in this, like a diamond quilt, which really looks great for a low plate like this. All I'm going to do now is just sew an overstitch basically around the edge to secure the vinyl and the sew foam together, and this also compresses the area where a stitch will eventually be put a 1/2 inch from the edge. So just do it close to the edge, just make sure you don't go into your seam allowance of a 1/2 inch.
Now that we're done with that, it's time to cut our top plate of fabric for the high foam.
This is our low-rise foam, this is our high-rise foam, this is 1 inch difference here. We have to talk about seam allowances and extra additions. So we're going to have a seam here, it's going to have a top stitch in it all the way around. So I'm not going to add anything here because I want it to be pulled down nice and tight. This 1 inch difference, I'm going to add 1 inch for this because that's the difference between the low rise and the high rise. And we're going to add a 1/2 inch for seam allowance. So this I know measures, if you measure straight across, 5 inches from here to here. So 5 plus 1 inch plus a 1/2 inch means that this is going to be 6.5 inches for this area. So we're going to add extra fabric here. So let's cut our high plate that includes that extra fabric. So our high-rise foam, you can see we can manipulate it, so you have to make sure you lay it down flat. The best way to do that is to take your low-rise foam, and we know that we need to add, let's see, yeah, we need to do it like this because that'll utilize less fabric. So I'm going to put it so the top side is down, then I'm going to take my high-rise foam and I'm going to fit it in there like a puzzle. Okay, now we know we're going to cut right along this edge, but we need to add extra to the inside edge for the fabric pull, 1/2 inch seam allowance, and also the extra 1 inch of foam. So we need to make sure this fits together well, and this could be almost right up against the edge of the fabric. But if it doesn't fit together well, it's not shaped perfectly. So make sure everything fits beautifully, snugly before you start tracing. So we know we're not adding any seam allowance here along the front edge for a nice tight pull, even though boxing will be sewn here. And we're going to mark around this edge. And we're going to mark here. Okay, now we're going to make sure this doesn't move as I remove the low foam. So keep it down nice and snug so you don't get anything out of place. There we go. We can move that out of the way. Now we need to mark it on the inside, making sure that you follow it exactly. So I've set this at 1.5 inches. That's our addition that we need to add to this. This is where the low foam goes, so this is the addition. And I like to actually hold this perpendicular or make sure that this line is going to be parallel to this, and I actually mark it. So I want to mark this just along this edge, but I want to do this very close together so that I have the exact shape, especially when I get to curves like this. Make sure you try to hold this perpendicular to this edge. So we're going to extend these lines following this edge, and we'll do the same thing here. We'll cut here on these dotted lines and here, but we were not going to cut there. So I just basically cut on the dots as carefully as possible with my scissors.
Because of the great curve that we have to use match-up marks to join the two plates together. That's next.
We'll take our high plate vinyl and our low plate vinyl, and we'll match it up to this line, not including the seam allowance or the excess to go over the 1 inch foam. And we're going to do match-up marks. If you don't do match-up marks, then things won't line up. Now remember, this could be askew a little bit, so make sure that you position it so that it's right up against your line before you do anything else, and then the edges are matched up. So here's how you do match-up marks. So what I do is I take a clear acrylic ruler and I go perpendicular to this edge or parallel on this line, and then I mark a line that's about 2 or 3 inches at that location, and I do this about every 3 inches or so. Now you want to make sure nothing moves. So we'll do it here, and we want to do this all around the perimeter, especially where there's shapes. Now see how this is shaped? So I'm skipping this area. I'm going to mark it there too, but I want to try to keep this parallel. It's not extremely important that it be, and I'm sorry, not parallel, but perpendicular, but I'm trying to do that as I do it. So I'll mark around this, and then we'll show you what's next. So here are all the matchup marks, okay? Now we have to account for the seam allowance. So we're gonna move this low plate over and get it out of the way. And we're gonna, because we made this line fairly long, we can make sure that our ruler is parallel to that line and carry it all the way to the edge. And we'll be able to notch it there. So we're gonna do this for every single one of these lines. So if you don't have a notcher, you can just take scissors and you can cut a really small triangle at each one of those locations like that. Let's see if I can pull that out. There you go. But we have a notcher that works pretty good with vinyl fabrics. It's not good for woven fabrics, and I can just do that. It doesn't cut it out completely, but it's enough to follow it as a reference. So we're going to do it on every one of these locations on this, the high plate, and we're also going to go over here to the low plate and do it on that as well. Now we have to take our bottom plate that has the line on here, and we have to use this and transfer those matchup marks to this. You may be asking, why do we need to do that? Well, when we sew the zipper on, we need to make sure that the zipper doesn't stretch. So these matchup marks will be used to secure our zipper between the bottom plate and the top plate. So we're just going to mark where every one of these matchup marks are on this. And once that's done, I'm going to take this away, and I'm going to just make sure that it goes through like somebody were stitching up, what do you call that guy, Frankenstein.
Now we can sew the high and low plates together.
So now that we have matchup marks, we can sew these oddly shaped pieces together without any issue. So outside surfaces would always face each other, and this is obviously how it goes together. So we're going to match, let's see, we'll be starting over here because this is going to be the easiest way to put it in the throat of the sewing machine. So the throat of the sewing machine would be over here. So you always want to think about that. So we're going to match this up, and we're going to sew an overstitch, which is on the edge rather than the seam allowance, which will help us to match up these marks as we go. So you need to trust the matchup marks. You need to make sure that they match up. They are your guide for a complex shape like this. So we're going to start at the end, and we're doing an overstitch very close to the raw edge, and I have it set for 3 millimeters stitch length. Hold the trailing threads. I'm going to do a little bit of reversing. Okay, so you can see the matchup mark there. I'm going to push the fabric in so that it's lined up. We're doing 3 millimeter stitch length. Here's the next matchup mark, and it looks like it's going to land exactly where we want it. The edges of the fabric need to be lined up, which they are. We're going to sew to it, and then I'm going to stop with my needle buried to check the next matchup mark. This is basically a straightaway. That's why they're all matching up a little bit. Looks like I need to pull a teeny bit on this to make it match up. Edges are lined up. We're past that matchup mark. Bury the needle. Now this one looks like it needs to be a little bit shrunk up a teeny bit to match up to that mark. We'll get to a point where we have to actually do a little bit more adjustment, and you'll see it here in a minute as soon as we have more shape. Okay, so here's the first one. My needle is buried, and I'm a long way off. And obviously I won't be able to stretch that very well, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut little slits, not going very deep at all. Especially, we don't want to go into our half-inch seam allowance, which we will be sewing later on. But this will allow us to stretch the fabric a little bit. And sometimes what I do is I use my edge match-up pliers. I'm going to try to keep my hand out of the way. Seth, the cameraman, is making sure that I'm not in the way of the camera. See how I'm pulling? And those little marks are basically allowing me to stretch the fabric a little bit. I'm going to bury my needle every time I stop. I'm going to check my matchup mark. I still need to pull a lot more. So I'm going to grab my fabric closer to the presser foot, pull with my matchup pliers, bury my needle. I'm getting closer, but I'm not there yet. Do the same thing again. There's obviously a lot of shape here. I'm following that edge, getting closer, not quite there. I'm going to pull a little bit more here. Bury my needle. And look at that, we are almost matched up. If I pull one final time here, I'm matched up. So again, trust the matchup marks. See how far I am here? So same thing, I don't think I'm going to be able to stretch without putting some cuts in it, or slits. So now that I have slits in it, I'm going to take my pliers and I'm going to pull. Now I'm matched up. Make sure the edges are lined up. Sometimes I grab both fabrics if I know the edge is lined up, and I just hold down with my finger. Not too hard to do. At the end, we should find that the fabric is almost perfectly lined up at the edges. It might be slightly off, which will be acceptable, but it'll be really, really close. This one's right on top of it, so I'm just going to grab both with my match-up pliers and push the fabric over so the edges are lined up. Sometimes you have to cut slits in the bottom one or shrink up the top one. And I think there'll be a spot where you'll see I'll have to shrink it up. I'm trying to find one. So far there isn't. But when we find one that is, I'll show you how we do that. Okay, I finally found one that's long. The top fabric is longer than our bottom fabric. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to match this up, and I'm going to kind of shrink the fabric up a little bit. Evenly. In other words, not so massively that I get a wrinkle, but distribute it kind of along the edge. So you can see how there's a little bit of a bubble in it as I go, and I'm keeping the match-up mark right on top of itself. I'll push this in a little bit. And then when we get to that point, you can see that we are matched up. So that's how you do it if you need to shrink a fabric a little bit. Now this one needs to be shrunk up quite a bit. So instead of just shrinking up the top plate, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut some slits in the bottom one here. Because this does have that sew foam on the back side. Now I can pull on the bottom one, thus matching up those marks. So that's the way to do it for that. But make sure your edges are lined up as you go. There's a lot of shape here. That's going to come out gorgeous. So this is with a 3mm overstitch, and if you unfold this, look at that. It's almost perfect. Let's see what this end looks like. It has a little dog ear, and so this one's a little bit off. I'll probably do some trimming here just to match that one up. I wish I were a little bit more accurate with that one, but it's still gonna work because it's very, very close. And it doesn't look wrinkly at all. Now we need to do our 1/2" seam allowance. So I have my magnetic guide on. I'm holding my trailing threads. I'm still at 3mm. I want to be very, very accurate with this. This is at a 1/2" from the needle. And I'm going to do some reversing here. And then I'm going to slowly sew around the edge here. And I'm going to make sure that it's right up against that guide and flat. So when I get to the curvy part, it's a little bit more tricky, but I'll show you how we kind of flatten it out. So here we're coming to the curve, so I'm going to make sure my fabric is kind of flat here like this. My fingers down here. Flatten out the fabric depending on your shape. This is very shapely. So this is an inside turn, and it's a little bit trickier. So what I'm going to do, as you can see, there's a bubble here. I'm going to flatten the bubble with my finger here and lay the fabric flat as I go, because I don't want to sew those bubbles in. So I'm just flattening where the seam allowance is going to go. No bubbles. Kind of pulling out on my fabric a little bit to get it to lay flat. Because of all this shape, fabric doesn't like to just lay flat. And so that's how you do an inside turn. So as you can see, the match-up marks are lined up nicely. This edge is almost perfect. There's hardly any wrinkles in this, if any. This edge is just a little tiny bit long, so I'm just going to trim it up so that it basically comes in line there, because it's just ever so close like that. That'll make it work perfectly.
A zippered fabric pull needs to be created to pull the vinyl fabric between the two separate pieces of foam. That's next.
So this is the fabric pull. This is the back plate. I've laid it on top of my vinyl here. And this is where the fabric pull goes. I'm going to start measuring 1.5 inches from the edge. And I'm just going to use a flexible tape measure and follow this. If it's not the exact size, it's okay, but we want it to be pretty close to it. So I'm just following the markings here. And then we want it to fall about 1.5 inches from here. So I'm going to make it 40 inches just to be safe here. And then I need to cut a strip that is the foam thickness of the low foam plus 1/2 inch. So our low foam was 3.5 inches. So we need our width of our fabric pull to be the thickness of the foam plus 1/2 inch. Our thickness of foam was 3.5 inches. So I need this to be 4 inches. So 4 inches is right there on our clear acrylic ruler. And I'm going to strike a line. This is my vinyl fabric, and I'm going to make it 40 inches. I like to just use the vinyl fabric for this. 40 inches stops there. As the fabric pull, nobody's going to see this, but this is a 4-way stretch, and it actually works great for a zipper pull like this. So I'm going to cut this out. For my fabric pull, I like to use number 10 coil zipper, and I want it to be probably about 3 inches longer on each end. So I'm going to use my scissors and cut it to about 3 inches. Doesn't have to be exact. That way I don't have to put stops on it, because the slider will basically keep it together. And the teeth are going to go down. So I'm going to go ahead and put double-sided tape on this and baste it right in the center of this application before cutting it. So let's take off the transfer paper, revealing the glue. I didn't put it all the way to the end because we're going to have the zipper sticking out. So we want to try to center this. And if you want to measure, you can, but I'm going to do it by sight because it just makes sewing one of the tasks much easier. And I'm trying not to stretch the zipper as I put it on them, trying to lay it down nice and smooth, because you can stretch a zipper so easily. So be careful of doing that. There we go. We're going to take it to the machine, and I'm not going to sew over this area on this end or the other. We're just going to sew right along here, reversing here and reversing here and reversing at the end. So we're going to leave this completely open. I'm not going to show sewing it. Now, since this zipper is so big, I'm actually going to cut on both sides of the teeth. That'll just make it easier for me to slide the slider on this. So I'm just going to do this carefully like that, just following the teeth, and I'll do it on this side as well. Then we'll show you what's next.
We'll take that fabric pull and sew it onto the plate assembly.
This is our zipper fabric pull, and it's going to go on so the teeth are facing towards the low foam where the sew foam is. So it's going to go on like this, so the vinyl side's this direction. And we're going to start here because that'll decrease the bulk going in the sewing machine, because it's going to be sewed on so that it follows this 1/2 inch stitch. Now we want to keep it about 1.5 inches away from the edge so that it doesn't get involved in our seam there. So I'm just going to mark it there, and this is where we'll start the vinyl. It's okay that this hangs over the edge, so let's take it to the machine. Okay, so vinyl side is facing down. This is the high-rise plate. We're going to line it up to this edge. We're going to sew within the seam allowance, and I am going to sew with a 6mm stitch length. Reason being is I don't want it to shrink up much, so that'll prevent some shrinkage. So let's do this. You could baste this if you'd like, but it's pretty easy to guide it. Just make sure I like to basically keep my foot up against the stitch, but the fabric up against the edge is against that 1/2 inch stitch is more important than anything else, which you can definitely see. So do some reversing here. So I'm sewing in the seam allowance, and then just slowly sew it, making sure that the edge is against the stitch. It's more important that you do that than to keep your stitch nice and straight, though I'm going to try to do both. Make sure you follow the curves, like I'm here on this curve, and it's okay to have a few little wrinkles be introduced if you have to, or cut slits in the zipper's flange. Now it's important to sew it on this side because you can see that if you kind of hold here and you pull on the fabric pull, see how it pulls that seam beautifully? If it were attached on this side, it wouldn't pull this down as deeply. So make sure you do that. And now here at the end, I had extra fabric and I stopped sewing about 1.5 inches, so I'm just going to cut this off, but I'm not going to cut off my zipper. I'm just going to cut off the vinyl up to that point where I stopped sewing and basically just leave that vinyl in place. Leave the zipper in place, and I'll do the same thing over here because we're going to need to do that on this side as well. Now that the zipper is on here, we can take these match-up marks and we can transfer them to the zipper's flange. I don't need to do it here because it's already secured, but I need to go up directly in line with that and mark the edge so that we can make sure that we sew this zipper onto the next one in the same manner. So I'm flattening it out here, and you could take a straight edge if you'd like and do it like this. Go through your match-up mark and mark it like that. So we're going to do this for all these locations. I'm going to put an X on this end and this over here so I know that this is the right side, and then separate it. Now we can set this one aside, and we know that this X goes over here because that was the same shape. And what I need to do is mark a line 1/2 inch from this. So I'm going to follow that same procedure, marking the line 1/2 inch on the high side all across this area. I'm going to go ahead and notch these because I am actually going to need to see it on the other side. We're going to put double-sided tape on this edge. Vinyl side is facing up. This is important because it is hard to keep this going on nice and straight. X goes to X over here. So this goes upside down facing the material. We're going to line it up to the match-up mark, which is there. You could extend the match-up marks over here, which would make it a good idea. I should have done that. So we want to put this on the dashes that you put on 1/2 inch away from that, because that's going to be our stitch line right here. And so that's going to be our stitch line right here. So the edge of the fabric is here, which is 1/2 inch away. So our calculations will be perfect. You want to try to match up the marks, so you may have to stretch or cut slits in this like we did before. Like this one needs a slit. I need to cut slits for this one to match it up. You get the idea. Now, since we can't use an edge guide, it's not a bad idea to mark 1/2 inch from the edge with dash marks. That way you know exactly where you need to sew. We can do this all the way down the length. We're going to stitch right on top of those dash marks, and we're going to do a 6mm stitch length because, again, I'm trying to avoid shrinkage. Make sure you reverse at the end. And you will have to make sure that everything is lined up as you sew, because there's a lot of shape in at least this one. It depends on obviously how much shape you have in your cushion, but check your match-up marks and make adjustments while you're sewing.
Now it's time to calculate and cut the boxing to the appropriate size.
Okay, these are my chicken scratches. Basically, this is the foam. I've done a rough cut, and this around it is the boxing, and this is the boxing. So here's how we're going to do this. To sew vinyl around a corner and have a seamed corner is a lot of bulk. So I'm going to try not to have any seam at the corner. The only seam I'm going to have is here because I need to do it to find out exactly where this falls. So what we're going to do is we're going to start here at the middle and leave this one long. So in other words, this is going to go past the middle a little bit, and this one's going to go past the middle. So I'm going to measure from here to here and write that measurement down, and then I'm going to go to cut, make sure it's a little bit longer, and then I'm going to measure from here all the way to here and make sure it's a little bit longer as well. That'll be this one boxing piece. For this piece, I'm going to measure from here and all the way to here, well, all the way to here, I'm sorry, because this is a different size foam here. And then we're going to write that down, and then basically from here to here and add some extra here. So let's do that on our foam. So there's our middle. I put my paper over here so I could use it as a reference. I'm going to measure to here, and I get 11 inches. We're going to make that one 12 inches, so I'm just going to write 12 here. And then I said I'm going to measure from here, wrap my soft tape measure all the way around, and make sure it's up against the foam and measure to here. I get 55 inches, so I'm going to make this one at least 57 inches. So I'll just put 5'7" here. That's extra long. And then I measure from here to here, and I know that's about 5 inches or so, so I'm going to make this 8, just to make it long. And then from here to our middle mark, I get 27, so I'm going to make it 29 inches, so 29 here. So there's our measurements for our boxing. Now let's talk about the thickness of the boxing. As you can see here, the height of our low-rise foam is 3.5 inches. We're going to cut the boxing width a 1/2 inch larger to 4 inches. So whatever your foam is, cut it a 1/2 inch wider. The height of our high-rise foam is 4.5 inches, so we're going to cut our boxing to 5 inches, a 1/2 inch larger than whatever your high-rise foam is. What I've done here is I've cut out some scrap to replicate the boxing. So this is my 29-inch piece here and my 57-inch piece here with the 12-inch piece here. Why did I do this? Well, because you need to know which side is the right side and the wrong side. So if I put this here, this is the 12-inch piece, and then the 57 wraps all the way around. It means it goes on just like that. So I marked it on both sides, but this is obviously the outside. So I'm going to write out and circle it for this because it's going to go on like this and wrap all the way around. Now for the other one, which is over here, I've made it another piece like this. It's 29 and 8, which is exactly what we have down here, 29 and 8. And I put it on both sides because I didn't know which side's the right side and the wrong side. It's basically like this. So this is the outside. So I'm going to mark O-U-T and circle it. So now we know which is the right side and wrong side of our fabric by using cutouts like this. Okay, so you can see it says out on this side. So this is the outside. So that means this is our vinyl for our boxing, which is facing down. So this one would go on like this, which means the 12-inch starts here, and then the 57 that is 5 inches starts here. So this is 4 inches tall. So what I'm going to do is just move that aside, and I know that my 12 inches is 4 inches because it's a 1/2 inch larger than our foam. So that I put the clear acrylic ruler on that edge, and then I use my scribe ball or a pencil, and I mark it to 12 inches right there. Okay. Now the 57 is 5 inches tall. Let's move this one aside. So I go up to my 5 inches at that location. So I'm at 5 inches. And this is the factory edge, so it's nice and straight. And I'm just going to go up like this, and then I'm going to go over like this and go all the way down until I reach 57 inches. Now, if I don't have long enough fabric, I have 2 yards, so I have plenty, then you could put a seam in it, but it's cumbersome, and I don't recommend it for a cushion that is this complicated. It's better to buy enough fabric so you can make your boxing as long as you need, which is, for this one, at least 2 yards. So at the top of this and this, we need to add our seam allowance, and we're going to write it right on the back side of this seating vinyl here at a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to mark over to here at a 1/2 inch and stop just right about there. And then up here, I'm going to mark all the way down its length at a 1/2 inch as well. And we'll show you what we do here. So I'm going to start about a 1/2 inch away from that edge here. So I'm going to mark all the way down. Here we want to be a 1/2 inch from here. So I'm going to put my clear acrylic ruler on here and make sure that I'm parallel here, or perpendicular, I guess, to this. And then we're going to go straight down all the way to the bottom edge here. And we want to round this area here. This right now is just 90 degrees. So I'm going to make a gentle curve which will help to pull the vinyl down here. This is going to be a 90-degree turn, so I'm about burying my needle at this junction and twist it here. Now I notice that because I did this curve here, we're no longer at a 1/2 inch. In fact, even if I did it from here, it's not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this guide here at a 1/2 inch and mark where the 1/2 inch falls. That way I know when I match up the fabric to the top plate that we have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm just going to do this, and now I have a 1/2 inch everywhere. 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, obviously 1/2 inch there. Okay, so now let's work on this one here. So this one, the outside is marked here. Okay, so here's our other one, and this is the wrong side. This is the outside surface as I have it marked. So that means it goes on like this. And we're going to put it right beside this other one that we did here. So basically I need to have my 4-inch piece. This is 4 inches and this would be 5 inches. Start here and be 29 inches over. So 4 inches right on my other line, and we need it to be 29 inches. So I got to scribe a line here, and 29 inches should be somewhere around in here. I'm going to measure here in a second as soon as I continue this line on a little bit further. Let's get my tape measure. So 29 inches is right here. I'm going to put a little mark there. And then at that juncture, we need to go up to the 5 inches. So I'm going to put this on 5 and make sure that it's straight with the bottom line. So 5 inches up from here, we're going to do this. And then this part needs to be at least 8 inches. So we're going to go over here, and I'll just go a little bit past 8 just to make sure we have plenty. And we'll extend this line down, making sure that it's perpendicular to that other one. Right there. And then we're going to do a 1/2 inch here, 1/2 inch here, and we're going to do the same corner like we did on the other one. So it's not a bad idea to take some scrap like I've done here and to actually do just what we did with the boxing and the plate here and sew them together. I'm doing this just as a reference. This is the top plate in blue and this is the boxing in brown, and I've marked it plate and boxing so you don't get confused. But here you can see that we have our stitch sewn right on that seam allowance, and here we have to make a slit because this has to spread apart at the 90-degree turn. And here at the rounded portion on the plate, we made a slit there because that has to spread apart. So when we cut this out, I'm going to follow that curve that we made there instead of the part that's marked, so right here. And we need to make a slit, not at the 90-degree. So basically, let me move this so you can do it. I'm going to try to stay out of the way. I want to go 45 degrees into that 90-degree turn, but I want to stay about an 1/8 inch away from it or so. So right about there. So notice that it's not right at that pivot point, and that we need to do that for this one and also for this one. We're going to cut these out.
Now we'll sew the boxing to the top plate assembly.
We're going to start sewing our boxing to our plate now. And to do that, we need this to fall exactly on that seam here between the two panels of fabric. And we need this to fall on the seam here. So to accomplish that, I have a middle section that needs to be joined together. I'm going to start sewing right about here. So we're going to call this A. I know that's upside down. Now it's not. So we'll start right here, and then we'll sew around like this. And before we come to this part where it needs to be joined, we're going to stop right here. So we'll say B, and this will be a stop. Okay, right about there. Then what we're going to do is we need this to match up. So we're going to start sewing probably here again. So this will be C, start, right there, and we will sew down this direction, and we will stop obviously before we come to this joint so we know where to join up the edges, okay? So once that's on, then we'll be able to join up the edges here and join up the edges here and complete the sewing in those two locations. Outside surfaces would face each other, so this is the piece that goes here. This is where we're going to start sewing someplace, probably right about here. This is where it's going to be joined together. So we need to make sure that this lines up with this. So that's the important point. And we want that to basically, if you splay it open, you can see exactly where that needle will enter at that location. So outside surfaces are facing each other. Let's take this to the machine. So I pinned this zipper back so it doesn't get in the way, and I also marked it a 1/2 inch from this edge. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the bulk out of this, and I need to do this carefully so that I don't go into this seam allowance. So I'm going to cut just close to that, but obviously on the inside of that. And then I'm going to rip out the stitches here so that I can splay this out flat like that. And I actually will fold this like this and put a stitch to make sure this sits flat. And you could even rip out this excess foam here, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to leave that in, and I'm going to sew outside of my seam allowance, so right about there. And I'm doing 3mm stitch length again. Okay, so that secures that down and reduces that bulk at that seam, and I'll do that on the other side as well. And I'm not going to show that, so right over here too. So I have a slit right here, and this is where it needs to be on top of the seam. So I know that that line basically is right on top of that, right there. This needs to go all the way up so it matches against that edge. We'll look to make sure we're lined up with the seam right here, in which we are. And that means that if I start sewing here, leaving enough fabric to join that together, right about here, and hold everything down nice and tight and sew on that 1/2 inch seam allowance with our 3mm stitch length, we should be good. And I'm not even going to do any reversing. I'm going to hold my trailers. And I want to be accurate, so I'm going to sew fairly slowly into this. Yes. Now when I get to that junction, which is right there, that's why we mark this with our seam allowance. There, needle's in, and I'm going to make sure the needle's coming up so I don't get a skip stitch. Then I'm going to pull this apart here by lifting my foot. And see how this edge lines up there? So this is a 1/2 inch from this edge, and I'll sew up this edge. Now we have the curve, and I want to bury the needle, and I want to pull this fabric over with my edge pliers. I'm going to try to keep my hands out of the way of the camera. So it's lined up at the edge, because that's our 1/2 inch. Okay. And I probably do one more stitch. I need to, there we go. Needle's still buried. I'm going to lift my foot, and I'm going to roll this around and actually grab my fabric, line it up with this edge. It looks like I need to cut some slits out of this because it's wanting to buckle on me. That'll help a little bit. Keep that edge down. Now I'm pretty much to my straightaway. Edges are lined up. Now before we get to this corner, I'm going to stop, boom, with my needle buried. I'm going to mark this a 1/2 inch from the edge. See the edge of the fabric? So right here, I'm going to slit it going and stop short of my seam allowance. I hope you can see this. Hope my hands aren't in the way. Okay, that'll allow me to pivot on that point. So watch this. This is a seamless corner, which is easier for a thick fabric like this. So the needle's buried across from that slit. I lift my foot, I pivot the material around, fold the material back here, and line up this edge. It should be a 1/2 inch, like that. Lower my foot and sew this direction. So we just made that corner. And now this is the curved part, and all you have to do is just make sure that the edges are lined up, and don't pull on one fabric more than the other. Just let it relax as you feed it in, because we don't have to worry about matching up anything else right now. Just got to match up this edge as we sew a 1/2 inch. And this is the side that has all that shape, but I don't think you need to see that. It's pretty self-explanatory. This is the corner that we want to stop at and join the opposite piece to, so that we can make sure it too is in the same spot. However, this corner is very curvy, so it makes it more difficult to determine exactly where this falls, but I still like to have plenty of excess, so I'm actually going to stop sewing just about here. I've matched up the edges everywhere, and I'm not going to do any reversing. I'm just going to continue my stitches over top of my previous stitches. So we're done with this one for now. We're not going to cut this until we join the other portion. Okay, so you can see we've got that one sewn on. We stopped short here. We have enough to join it together here. This one needs to fall at that same spot, which means outside surfaces face each other. So I'm going to start sewing here and sew down to here around this corner, and then leave excess so we can join that together. So this one's a little bit more difficult, and the reason being is that I'm going to start here, and I have to know how much fabric it's going to take up to round this. So what I do is I'll again put that line, this line, on the seam allowance here, so it's matched up. This would actually come down and be bound here, and then this, I'm going to roll this around, so we'll be sewing it like that. I'm going to hold my finger here, and this is going to basically be pivoting around here, so I'm going to hold my finger there, and then I can pretty much walk this up. So again, I'm holding pressure down, so I know exactly where I need to start, but yet I want to have enough material that I can join these two together. So I'm going to start right here, and I think this is the right spot. So again, I'm holding it all together so that we land at the right spot. Get it underneath the foot, make sure the edge is matched up, no reversing. My trailer threads are long enough evidently that it didn't get pulled through, which is good. And we're going to start sewing this way and see what we get. Take my edge pliers, try to keep my hand out of the way. Sorry if it's not. Pull this around. Bury my needle, rotate this around. And looks like I'm going to hit that spot pretty nicely. So I'm almost on the cross. Right now I think I'm on it. I'm going to use, I'm just a little bit past it. So I'm going to use my reverse lever and go backwards just a little bit. There we go. Needle's coming up. Now I can lift my foot. I can pivot this back. And I can sew down. Oops, make sure that wrinkle's pushed back. There we go. Wrinkles out of the way. Sew down this side. Again, sewing 3mm stitch length. Now I'm sewing through the sew foam as well here, and we're going to do the same thing at the corner. I'm not pulling really on anything. Getting close to that corner. I'm going to mark it at a 1/2 inch, slit it just like we did before. Oops, let's do this so that you can see it. 1/2 inch right there. Slit it, going not too deep. Bury my needle at that juncture, which is good. Coming up slightly, pivot, push this back as I lift my foot. Lower my foot, continue to sew. Now we're getting close to the junction, but I want to be closer so I know exactly where it falls and still have enough material to work with, which should be right there. No reversing. Take my fabric out. So this is the middle where we're going to have the joint, and I'm going to mark it there because this would obviously sew up to that point, and then we need to mark it a 1/2 inch from there because this is going to be our cut. So I'll cut right there so it's perpendicular to this edge or parallel to this edge. Then we'll lay this one, let's just move this out of the way, right there. It would sew up to that point. So there is our mark. Again, we need to add 1/2 inch for seam allowance, which would be right there. So this will be our cut. We're going to cut all the way across parallel to this edge or perpendicular to this edge. This corner is wacko. So I'm going to take my 1/2 inch guide and mark where the 1/2 inch, oops, I don't think it's on a 1/2 inch, right there. So we'll mark it where it's at a 1/2 inch, and then I'm going to come over here and mark it at a 1/2 inch as well. And then we will follow this. So right here is our seam allowance. If you wet the tip of this, it actually marks really well. And right there's our seam allowance. So this is where our corner is going to fall, okay? All this, if you measure this, is way outside of a 1/2 inch. So that's why it's important to do this at weird corners like this. So let's follow this up, because we have it sewn here. Sometimes if you raise it off the table, it's easier to follow it with shapely things like this. And where does that 1/2 inch fall? It falls right there. So I'm going to mark it. That should be right on top of that edge there. And let's do the same thing with this one. This one's a little bit more difficult because of this stupid curve. Oh, did I just say stupid? I didn't mean that. So I'm going to follow this curve. Kind of the fabric has to shrink up to follow the curve. Which means it's going to fall right there. Okay, so now what do? We do a 1/2 inch past that right here, and we're going to cut up perpendicular to this edge. I know it seems weird because you got all the shape here, but we're still going to be perpendicular to this edge or parallel to this other edge. And we're going to mark a 1/2 inch outside this one and cut perpendicular to this edge or parallel to this edge. So these are our cuts. So here's where I'm going to be sewing. That's a 1/2 inch from this edge, and this is a 1/2 inch here. I also want to put a 1/2 inch here. Why is this? Well, I'm going to reduce the bulk by sewing here and doing some back tacking and not sewing over here and sewing all the way to here and sewing one stitch past this and doing some back tacking. Then we can cut out the bulk. We'll show you what that looks like in the end. So I applied basting tape. Why did I do that here? Well, because it's really hard to keep this lined up as you're sewing because you've sewed it together so close to the end, and I'll baste it together so that the edges are lined up and these edges are lined up. And now I don't have to worry about it moving. So I can force it into the throat of the sewing machine. Remember, we want to start sewing just a teeny bit past that point and make sure that we lock the stitch down well there. So I'm going to do some one stitching forward, and I'm going to sew back, making sure that I went through at least one stitch, and back one more time so it's locked down well. We're on top of that 1/2 inch seam allowance. When I get down here, I'm going to sew one stitch past in reverse and then sew it into that area in reverse again. So that should secure it well. So with this middle part, it's not a corner, so I don't have to worry about sewing and stopping at the 1/2 inch. I can sew all the way across it and do reversing all the way. So let's line this up and sew it together, and I'll show you what it's like when we're done.
We did not show sewing that.
Okay, with this middle one, I'm sewing it all the way. I'm going to go ahead and remove the double-sided tape from this so I can butterfly it out. So I basically just grab the Mylar film, pull it out, and now I can butterfly this down as I sew the remainder left. Remember, we stopped here and stopped here. So all I'm going to do is sew over top of those previous stitches by probably 1 inch or so. And again, I don't like to do reversing in cushions because sometimes you can see the reversing. So just sew over top of this, butterfly it out, and then when we reach the previous stitches, which are right here, we'll sew over those by about 1 inch. Okay, and then we'll stop. We're going to pull our double-sided tape out of this complex corner. I've applied double-sided tape here and also here in the effort to splay this one out on that first stitch. So like this. Some people use contact cement for this as well. And then we'll do the same thing with this one. So now we're on that stitch, splayed out nicely. So now I'm going to put this back in the machine, and I'm going to sew over top of my previous stitches by 1 inch or 2. Just like we did before. Make sure that you're on top of those stitches or your stitch will be visible. And once I get to the spot where I haven't sewn, I got to make sure that this edge is lined up since it's got so much shape. So I'm going to be using my edge guide pliers. Take your time here. There's a lot of shape going on here. Now when I get to this corner, I am going to hold it down and I'm going to sew all the way to my stitch. So basically I'm right on top of that stitch. Then I'm going to lift the needle, or lift the foot, and the needle's buried, and I'm going to roll this fabric around. Underneath here and roll this over in front of me. Hopefully it's not on my mic. And I'm going to push this fabric back because it looks like I have a little bit of extra fabric in here, but as long as I keep it pushed back and push that excess out, because you might have too little, too much. In my scenario, I have a little bit too much, so I'm kind of stretching it or pushing it into the foot so that it takes out the excess. Now I'm on top of my previous stitches, and I'll sew just about 1 inch or so, and we are done. So you can see I have a little bit of extra fabric in here, but I am going to do a top stitch, which will definitely help because I can kind of pull that out, and we can also use a heat gun. I'm going to cut off a little bit of this excess here, and also here, going up into here, and this removes some of the bulk out of the way. Oops, I didn't cut here. Okay, and then I can basically trim this off as well. Probably just do it like this. That way I have a nice corner. And remove this. Cool.
We'll be top stitching this seam allowance onto the boxing side.
In preparation for the top stitch, we're going to be folding the seam allowance down to the boxing. So at corners like this, what you want to do is cut out the excess here to reduce the bulk, because you want to think about how the seam allowance is going to lay. So if we cut that out, that will help when I push this right side out like this. What you should do is take a look at it and see if this lays nicely into the corner. As you can see, it does now. So the same thing with this. I'm going to push this right side out so that you get the natural curve that we're supposed to have that looks like that. And then I'm going to look at my seam allowance here, and you can see I've got wrinkles in here and so forth. What you want to do is you want to cut that out so that this lays as flat as possible. So push your finger against the seam, see the little wrinkle. See wrinkle run? I'm going to take this, and this side is the one that's wrinkling, and I'm going to cut this out like that, and then I can push my finger back in here, and it is getting better. It's still not perfect. I'm going to keep cutting until I get this to lay flat. I don't want to take away all the seam allowance material because then it won't sew through it, but you definitely don't want bulk. Actually, that's not that bad like that. There's a little bit of a wrinkle here, but I think it's going to flatten out pretty nice. So I think that's good. And we'll do the same thing to all the corners. Here we have sew foam, and we'll just chop this out, and we'll do the same thing over here. Okay, we're getting ready for the top stitch, so I'm going to turn the assembly basically so it's right side out like this. Here's the back middle. I'm going to start someplace close to that, and I have my edge guide foot on the fabricator sewing machine. This is on the left side. I think it's 3 millimeters from the stitch. We have different sizes if you'd like, and I am going to sew a 6 millimeter straight stitch for the top stitch. It just looks better. So the edge guide foot goes in here. The seam allowance is off towards the throat of the sewing machine to the right, so I'm going to be sewing through the seam allowance. I'm not going to do any reversing here because we're going to tie the stitches together when we come around. So just pull the fabric apart left and right, and the edge guide foot pretty much does this job for you. Now you don't want to go fast because this is a stitch that everyone's going to see, and when you get to the corners, it's going to be hard for you to see what we do at the corners because the camera angle is going to be bad, but you have to stretch the fabric out. I'm going to try to get my hands out of the way. This is the corner for the high foam going from the low foam, and I'll show you what we do there.
The Sayrite Fabricator is a compound walking foot. The needle moves back with the center foot as it pulls the fabric. Don't get confused by other machines that look alike but don't have that feature.
Okay, so notice that I'm spreading the material out just so that even if it's just one stitch, I want to try to concentrate on getting that one stitch to lay right where it's supposed to with the fabric spread left and right. So when the needle comes up to that 90-degree point, one past it, then I'm going to lift my foot a little bit and rotate the fabric around so that this foot is on the seam, and I'm going to spread this out. I know it's hard to see because there's a lot of bulk here, but notice I'm just pulling this out. Just take my word for it. If you can't see it, I don't know if you can. And if you have to just do one stitch at a time, just do one stitch at a time, then readjust your fabric. Okay, so I'm almost pretty much past that. Make sure your seam allowance is going in the right direction. I can feel it, so I know it is. Spread it out. So that's the complicated corner. Now we're going to come to almost a 90-degree corner. I can feel my seam allowance is in the right spot. And once you see this corner, you pretty much got the rest of it. And when we get around this corner, I'll show you what we do when we meet the the part where we began and how we tie a stitch. Anytime that you do adjustments, make sure your needle is in the fabric. I know you can't probably see this, but I'm making sure that it's splayed out. Needle's buried. I need to pivot around this corner, so I'm going to grab the fabric, pull. There we go, that's looking good. I put my finger in front of the foot and I pull it left, and I'm going to sew right about there, which should be my pivot point. Lift my foot, roll the fabric around, lower it, pull the fabric out flat, and sew. Okay, now everything else is pretty nice. Just make sure the seam allowance is going the right direction. And we'll come back to the point when we have to tie the ends together.
You may be asking, do you need the edge guide foot to do a top stitch like this? No, you don't. It's possible to do it without it by using your standard foot as a guide, but it does make the job a lot easier. If you're doing complex cushions like this that typically cost a lot of money to have fabricated, you might want to think about purchasing an edge guide foot. So the reason we shot this clip is that we had a better camera angle, so you can see how I am spreading the material apart at the corner, and then I try to bury my needle at the same location when I turn the assembly 90 degrees so that it's in line with the opposite side's stitching. And then lower the foot once you turn that corner and continue to sew, but make sure you pull the fabric apart as you see here.
Okay, we're coming up to the point where we started sewing, and I will show you now how to tie a stitch together so that you have no reverse stitching. And you want to try to land in that exact same hole if possible, which means you may have to make an adjustment to how your stitch is coming up to that point. I'm going to try to land in that first hole, and I'm going to do this by hand, and I'm going to lift my foot if I need to. Looks like I'm going to land right in it, which is exactly what I want. If I needed to, I'd just lift this up, and yeah, I'm landing right in it. So I've landed in the hole, and then I'm just going to have my needle come up and stop right there. I'm going to pull out my fabric like this, and I'm going to leave a tail. I want to make sure I leave a tail so I can tie this. So I'm going to cut it here and here. So we have these two threads at the top. We're going to flip this over to the underside because we want to pull those through to the bottom side. So you have two threads on the bottom side. So just pull on this, and you can see the little loop, and take a seam ripper. Don't cut your threads, but just grab the loop, pull it through. And then on this one, you need to give it a yank. See the loop come up, yank, yank, yank. And then I just take a seam ripper and I put it in that loop without cutting it, and pull it to the back side. So now I have no threads on the front and all of them on the back. So you'll see here that I have threads to the left. I have a thread to the left, I have a thread to the right, and I have two threads in the middle. So grab one of the threads, it doesn't matter which, and tie it to the one on one side. So we're going to just do a double hand knot here. Sorry, my hands are very big. So one like that, and then we'll use this leg and go through. Just a knot is basically what I'm doing. Ugh. And we tied it and cinch it down hard like that, okay? Now we take the other middle thread and the one on the opposite side, and we do the same thing. We tie those two together. One and two. And so now we have a top stitch that has no reversing. You can't really tell. I can tell a little bit because the stitch length is a little bit different, but that looks awesome. I'm just going to use a thread burner to kind of melt or mushroom the ends of the threads a little bit. That should keep them from coming undone.
One of the final steps is sewing the bottom plate onto the assembly.
Preparation for joining the bottom plate, which is this, to the assembly. Pin your zippers back, which I've already done to keep them out of the sewing area. This is the inside, and I've already put double-sided tape, 1/4-inch seam stick for canvas and upholstery around the entire perimeter. So now leave the right side of the bottom plate up and take your assembly and match it up to the shape so it would go like this. So outside surfaces will face each other. And before we do that, I forgot to do this. So we need to find the corner and make it adjacent to this before we start basting it. So what I just typically do is just look down it, and then I just create a small little triangle here. We'll have to make a slit in there, but at least I know where that falls directly in line, and we'll do that with all the corners. So we'll peel off the transfer paper, and I'm going to peel a little bit of this back too. And we're going to put that corner, and I am going to have to make a slit going no deeper than our seam allowance. Put it right there. And we will baste that down like that. The nice thing about basting before you sew is that you can make modifications to the assembly if corners don't match up. So I baste up this side a little bit, making sure the edges are lined up, and then we'll do it down here. And I want to try not to pull or stretch more than one on the fabric unless I need to. So we're going to do this, and hopefully when we get to this corner, it's going to line up. If it doesn't, then we have to make modifications. Because we can't change this. Let's cut a slit in that, right at that triangle that we made. Sometimes when there's a lot of shape, I'll actually lift it up, and so see it's off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to peel it back up, and I will pull a little bit on this top plate. Not to the point where I create hard spots. I'll come all the way to here, and then so I know that I need to basically stretch this out. So as I'm going to pull a little bit and baste it down, and that should make this up. There we go. Let's see if this improves it. Now look, oh yeah, look at that. It's going to come a 1/2 inch from the corner, which is what we want. And I'm going to peel this up so I don't have to worry about that. And since this has some shape in it, I'm just going to baste it up while it's in the air. Like that. And then we'll continue to go around the entire thing following this procedure. Okay, so we have it all basted together. This is what the seam over here looks like that we're going to go through. Everything looks great. Make sure that it's secured well. This corner looks good, so we're ready to sew. We're going to sew at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'm going to use the magnetic guide here. This is an easy process. No reversing at the beginning, just start anywhere. And we are sewing in 3mm stitch length again. If it comes unbasted, make sure you rebaste it. Came unbasted a little bit there. Make sure that everything is lined up and sew around. And I'll show you one corner, which is pretty much the same as what I've shown before in the video. And then we'll just sew over our previous stitches by about an inch or 2 when we reach them. So let's just show this one corner. So stop a 1/2 inch from the corner, which is a little bit less than that right there. Needle coming up, buried in the fabric, lift the foot, roll the assembly around make sure everything's stuck together. Lower the foot. I want to make sure I don't have any wrinkles in front of my needle, and sew down the side. All right, that's it.
All the other corners are seamless. This one is a seamed corner, so we decided that we should show this one nonetheless, just so you can see the process. It's basically the same thing. Up next, we'll insert the foam into the cushion cover. We're going to use two techniques, one without silk film and the second with silk film.
Now we want to make sure that you remove the pins, because I hate turning the assembly right side out and getting stuck with a pin. So there are pins holding the ends of the zipper. And then we're going to turn this right side out. To do that, open up this zipper and put your hand inside and do the laborious task of flipping it right side out and pushing out all the corners. I'll show you what it looks like when we're done, since this takes a couple minutes. So I didn't cut this corner out. I should have probably did that. I just like to cut the bulk out, and that'll make it lay a lot nicer at this extreme corner. Let's just fold it now first. Okay, this is the difficult task of inserting the foam, and it's better to have two people, but I'm going to try to do it on my own.
For this high foam, we chose not to use silk film to show how you can insert it without it. We'll show later on using silk film.
This is the high foam, and it goes all the way towards the front.
We're going to speed this up a little bit. The issue that we're having here is that the foam is sticking to the backside of the seating vinyl. That's one of the advantages of using the silk film. It becomes very slippery. But the silk film also does prevent breathability. We'll talk about that in a minute.
Got to pull this down into this corner. There's too much foam at that rounded spot. You can expect to take 5 minutes to do this, to get it to lay exactly the way you want it.
Had we used silk film, we could have used a shop vac and sucked the foam down. It would have compressed it nicely to get it in the appropriate spot, and then it also would have made the foam slippery so it slides into its appropriate position
now,
easily.
The seam allowance on the bottom plate probably should go either on the boxing side or the top side. You could decide. I'm going to put it on the top of the foam, so I'm going to put my finger in here because we don't have a top stitch for that, and I'm going to roll it around so that it sits on the top, because I think it'll look better that way. So I don't know if you can see the long zipper ends. They're longer on this side than they are on the other, and I pulled them out. So I'm going to put the slider on there before we get too far in here, it's going to be hard to see this, so just trust me that I'm putting the slider on, and we're not going to zip it up yet. We're just going to have the slider on it so that we can zip it up. So I have the seam allowance up on the top side of the foam, which is actually the bottom side of the foam, all around the perimeter, because I've just put my fingers in there and worked it. I have the zipper started. You have to smush down and make sure the zipper flange is on the correct side of the foam. When you zip it all around, I'm going to stop a little bit short here, and then we're going to make sure that everything is rolled where we want it to, that the foam's going deeply in the corners. And I think that looks pretty good. If your corner is smashed like this, you can use fiber fill and actually get it to come out pretty nicely. So watch, what I'll do is I'll leave it even zipped up, and then I'll take the fiber fill and I'll stick it through, and I push my fingers or push it into that corner. Now you don't want it to be lumpy, but that's the beauty of this fiber fill. It's siliconized, so it actually isn't very lumpy. It isn't uncommon for the foam not to go in the corners, especially if it's not a firm foam. And look at that, that already looks 100% better. Now if we take a heat gun to it, it'll also rest better.
The fabric pull between the high foam and the low foam still has the zipper's slider installed. That slider can be removed since we made the ends of the zipper longer and it still has its appropriate strength, or you can leave the slider in place. It's your choice.
So this is silk film, and what I've done is I've just wrapped it with the back facing me so I can insert a vacuum and suck it down. Now the issue with silk film is it blocks all the characteristics of the breathability of the holes. So we'll rip it out after we're done, but trying to get closed cell foam and a firm foam and a cover is quite difficult.
As we discussed earlier,
so this is
you can use the silk film to compress your foam to make it easy to insert it in the cover, and it also makes it very slippery, so it slips into place.
So the silk film does two things. It makes the foam slippery so it slides into place, and also you can compress it with a good shop vac. You can't do it with a dinky thing. Now it's still got the air. When I introduced air, watch what happens. It'll just poof right up. So it kind of finds its way into all the corners. You still may have to help it a little bit, but again, I'm going to rip out the silk foam from the bottom side so that I get the features of the closed cell foam and the breathability of those holes that we drilled. Just have to tear it out piece by piece. Or push it to the side. You can do that too. I'm using my finger to make sure the seam allowance is on the underside of the foam again. And then we can zip it up and to check out to see what the top side looks like. Oh yeah, very nice. Now let's talk about these corners. If I use a heat gun carefully, because you can actually melt the surface of the vinyl and heat it up and work it out. This is a time-consuming process, but it does help. And you can also ruin your vinyl if you're not careful. Don't let that heat gun touch the vinyl. You can use a steamer too. A steamer actually is a little bit more forgiving because it introduces some moisture on the vinyl as well. So anywhere there's a small wrinkle, and see the vinyl's getting to the point where I can hardly touch it, but I'm basically trying to meld it into the shape that I want. So this is a time-consuming process, but
our
for a
curved
professional,
knee-roll cushion with fabric
this is
backing
done all
is
the
now
time with the
complete.
seating vinyl.
Check out the full materials and
For any
tools that we
imperfections.
used to make this curved knee roll cushion in the description of the video below. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe and click the bell to be notified of new tutorial videos when they become available. I'm Eric Grant, and from all of us here at Sailrite, thanks for watching.